Okay, thank you. So as I said, we do have this link to our the slide deck link to our session. And so you'll be able to access all the resources that we have in here. And that will be especially good since obviously now for time, we're going to be pretty much rushing through this. But really the purpose of this is as principals, you may not be as involved in the actual MTSS behavior process in the majority of our schools, at least. That is often the function more of the assistant principal, the counselors, mental health practitioners, folks like that who are doing those behavior interventions and determining appropriate interventions, monitoring those and doing all that work. But as principals, we know that you need to at least have a deep understanding of what should be happening. And I say should be because, JCPS is a large district. And so I'm not pretend that this is what all of our schools do. Full transparency, of course, some schools are further along in the process of implementing MTSS than others are, just like any other work that we do. So having said all that, here's our contact information. Please feel free to reach out to either Molly or myself. We're always happy to talk with other districts and provide more resources if we can. There's also a link to our website, which has lots of training videos and different things like that. So, so the first step in the MTSS behavior process is this process initiation. Somehow we get kids that have come to our radar in some way, to your team of people who are doing this MTSS work. And that can come from monthly behavior data analysis. You're just looking at your office referrals, your suspensions, all of that data. It can come from academic PLC work, where your PLCs meet and start expressing some concerns about the behavior of a kiddo. Maybe a parent or a teacher or your administrators request that the team look at this child and assess whether interventions would be appropriate. Or you do a universal screener. Which is law. So everyone should be doing a universal behavior screener at some point in the year, analyzing that data to determine who is at risk for interventions. The main point of this data sheet, and again, it is linked there, but the main point of this is just to indicate that we never want to make decisions on a student based on one piece of data. One piece of data is part of the story. It is never the complete story of a student. And so we want to be looking at everything. Does the student have an IEP? Are they 504? Are they gifted and talented? What classroom data is going on? Is their teacher a new teacher? So is the issue maybe not so much with the student, but with the systems that are in place? And if we supported that teacher, all students in the class could benefit. So looking at all that information before we move a student through the MTSS process. And we do have guiding questions that we've written that help you analyze that data. So looking at all the different pieces of data, what kind of questions should your team be discussing? And so we have that as a great resource for you to and for teams to use in discussing that data. Whoops. And then Molly's going to take us into the next section, determine appropriate tier of supports.
Okay, yeah, so we are going to look at this. How is my volume? Are you all able to hear me? What I hear on your end is super choppy, so I just wanted to make sure.
You're a little choppy, but we hear you.
Okay. All right. So one of the things that we want to look at when we are thinking about MTSS, especially behavior, we want to be able to have an entrance and exit criteria. So we have an example, and every school is going to be personalized for them. So this is just one example of tier 2 entrance criteria. And also in the other column, you'll see the exit criteria list. So we have that for both tiers 2 and tier 3. So we're looking at behavior data. And like I said, every schools will be a little bit different, but we're going to be able to use all of those different data pieces because we want to be able to collaborate and communicate, because we want to make sure that we are addressing the correct behaviors. Because a lot of times, behaviors, there's not just one behavior. Usually it's lots of different behaviors. So we make sure that we are addressing things correctly. And then also, we want to make sure, is the student already receiving an intervention? Possibly the student may be in receiving academic interventions as well. So we want to be able to look at a protocol. So obviously, we're going to start and we're going to be looking at those universal screenings. We're going to be able to review advice. And then based on that, we want to be able to make sure that what we as adults do, what we are doing, we're giving action. These are not students that tier 2 students. We are making sure that we as the adults are providing the correct interventions. So we need to be able to look at, we need to review and monitor our progress data. And then if we're noticing that that's not really helping, then may need to increase more individualized tier 3 interventions. So you can look here, there are different examples of the graphs, and we want to know that we are looking at the trend line. And then we're also thinking, are they meeting their goal? Are we going to consider fading intervention? Or maybe we need to continue our intervention. Right? And then what we're doing is, once we've identified that, then we need to make sure that we are choosing the appropriate intervention. A lot of times we'll say, oh, we have check in, check out, when really that behavior doesn't match the student's behavior. So we need to make sure that we are choosing the most effective intervention for that behavior. We need to determine how it's going to be implemented. How's progress going to be monitored? Who's going to be responsible for that? When is our team going to meet to review that data? And then we also need to make sure that we are coming up with a goal for the implementation, that we're able to collect, document the plan, collect that baseline data. So what we have here on the next slide, we have some different examples of evidence-based interventions. So Sandra, thank you for pulling those up. So this is a great tool for MTSS teams to use. You can see the different columns. They're the interventions. Then you can look also at what the behaviors are. You can look at which students may be a good fit for this intervention and different resources. So this is a very helpful tool that I think most teams would find helpful. And another tool that we like to share is our student intervention matching form. If you all have been to Behavior Institute, I'm sure you are familiar with Dr. Clayton Cook. This is a form that he shared for intervention matching. And then another tool that we have is sample behavior goals. So we're looking at target behaviors. We're also thinking about replacement behaviors, okay? Because we know target behaviors, these behaviors aren't going to stop with just a quick snap. We're going to have to identify that target behavior. We're going to have to determine what is a replacement behavior. What is a baby step that I'm going to be willing to take to get to that replacement behavior? What monitoring tool are we going to use? And then in the last column, you'll see the goals, sample goals. So I think that that is a tool that you'll find helpful also. Okay, and then what we're going to look at next is, once we've determined the interventions, then we're going to need to make sure that we are documenting that progress. Okay, we are looking at a progress monitoring tool. This is an example one. It's pretty self-explanatory. So you'll be able to have all of that information because you want to be able to look at the whole child. You want to make sure that you are including all different data points. Okay. And then once you have that, and then you've created your goal, then you're going to be able to look at that data. And that graph is there for you. And you're going to have to determine, when are we going to look at it? Who all is going to be involved in looking at that data? Do we have enough data points? So this is another progress monitoring tool that I think you could find helpful. And then once we do that, we know that we need to review that progress. We're not just collecting data just to be compliant. We are doing that because we want to be able to analyze that data. We want to make sure, do we have the correct interventions in there? And a lot of times, especially with behavior, is once you start to intervene in one area and that behavior may begin to improve, you may see other behaviors. So you need to make sure that you're analyzing this data, pulling in any other pertinent data. You know, we have to make sure that we're collaborating. This is a team effort. We need to make sure that we are looking at information possibly from the nurse, possibly from your family resource. We need to make sure we're looking at attendance. We're looking at all of these things. And we also have the cycle protocol, which we showed you earlier. And then we also take it back to that entrance and exit criteria. What are we doing with the data that we have? Is this something that maybe we need to add another intervention to what we're currently doing? Because we're not going to just stop what we are doing, but we may need to layer to make sure that we are helping that student be successful behaviorally. Okay, and then, yep, these were just some more examples.
So then when we think about big picture, so I've had a few things in my time leading this team and leading this work in our district. The first thing was to get people to stop calling it PBIS and say PBIS instead. But then one of the other things is really, as an English teacher, language is really, really important to me. And so that idea that we kept hearing about tier 2 kids, tier 3 kids, and like Molly said, they aren't tier 2 kids or tier 3 kids because MTSS is cyclical by nature. We need that entrance and exit criteria because we want kids to move through the tiers. What we're ideally doing, and so this is part of that language shift, is to say kids receiving tier 2 interventions, kids receiving tier 3 interventions, to help reinforce that MTSS is not the pathway to an ECE referral, a special ed referral. That's not the goal of MTSS. Ideally, what we're doing is we're ensuring that only those who truly need services, those who actually have disabilities, who aren't just going to be successful with just an intervention, that those are the ones who are referred to special ed. So it's not saying that going through MTSS is going to help every kid. It will help every kid, but it may not be enough for every kid. They may need that IEP. They might need those specialized services that special ed supplies. And so I always think of Ralph Waldo Emerson with his quote of, "It's not the destination, it's the journey." MTSS is the journey, right? So it's meandering through. You might have a kiddo who starts a tier 2 intervention, needs a tier 3 intervention for a while, then you're able to fade that and go back to a tier 2 intervention. They're perfectly successful. And then you're able to fade them back and all they're receiving is those universal tier 1 interventions. That's the goal. So just some questions for you to consider is, what does the MTSS student referral process look like in your school? Do teachers know how to refer to the MTSS team? Do they know who's on the MTSS team? Does your school have school specific? So again, this can't be a district thing. Even if you have a small district, If you have two schools, each school is going to have different criteria because each school has different data that they would use to identify that criteria. And then how do you think that would be a useful tool to have? And then what interventions have you found to be effective with your students? If you aren't effectively tracking your interventions and your students who are receiving interventions and what the outcome of those interventions are, you have no idea if your interventions are successful or not. So you need to have that data in some form. And then what are some barriers to collecting data, and what have you found helpful in minimizing those barriers? We know that it can be overwhelming for teachers. You know, we have some teachers in some of our schools who have maybe 4 or 5 kids in their classroom who are receiving tier 2 interventions. And is it realistic to expect them to collect data? No. So how can we adapt what we're expecting from those teachers to make it realistic and overcome those barriers? We have to consider the teacher in that progress monitoring as well. And so finally, we just have a few resources for you. Of course, I have to shout out the Kentucky MTSS site. There are great resources on there, great information. If you haven't signed up for their newsletter, make sure you do that. Again, it's always helpful information, and they have the whole MTSS model and statewide plan. Kentucky ABRI is another great source of information with some training videos and that sort of thing. I also want to just give a plug for some videos that we made just about 1.5 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, that we created for our schools to help them train. So there's just an overview of what is MTSS in general. And then there's 2 different slides here that this link will take you to. One is for elementary module and one is for secondary modules. And you can see it's basically MTSS team training. So it's universal screeners, tier 1 MTSS, identifying students for tiered interventions, evidence-based interventions, and progress monitoring. Each module is, I think, around 30-ish minutes, some maybe more, some less. They were all written by Dr. Terry Scott at the University of Louisville, who's an amazing behavioralist. And so, it's an actual team sitting down talking with kids, because sometimes teams know what they're supposed to be talking about and what they're supposed to be doing, but they don't necessarily really get what that looks like. So it can be helpful for them to have that visual and see what that process is and what that looks like with a team doing it. So we wanted to put those on there for you as well. And then I don't know if we have it looks like we have a couple minutes for questions, if anyone has any. Sorry, I know that was like breakneck speed.
You guys did great, though, getting through all that content in such a short amount of time.
Thank you.
So we do have about 3 minutes. If people have questions, you can post them in the chat. Oh, Tracy wants to know, how do we get the PowerPoint?
It should be linked on the session information sheet. And if the links in that don't work, just shoot me an email and I'll just send it to you.
And Jennifer wants to know what you use as your universal screener.
Right now, most of our schools use the SRSS. We did for, I think, 2 years, our CCEIS schools, so about 20 schools that we'd identified for additional support. We're using FastBridge, or Sabres by FastBridge. They had a data leak, and there were some things there were some data issues, some data breach issues, and our software approval team would no longer approve them. I thought that was a great tool for our middle schools and high schools. They use the Pearson Best screener. So those are the 2, SRSS and Pearson Best are the 2 that we use. The great thing about the SRSS is it's free, but unfortunately it's not online, so it doesn't automatically graph things for you and that sort of thing. So it's a little more work on the part of the schools to analyze that data, but it's a great tool.
We have a question about what is the SRSS?
The Student Risk Screening Scale. So it looks at internalizing and externalizing behaviors. Teachers, it takes about 2 minutes per student. They're just considering behaviors over the past like 4 weeks, and thinking, what have they seen in that student, identifying, and then it identifies the student as low risk, moderate risk, or high risk. That does not equate to tiering. That's a mistake some people make. Just because a student is identified as high risk, that does not mean they need tier 3 interventions. So you have to be careful with that. Again, you're always going to bring in more data, because that's a barrier teachers have in even implementing a universal screener. They also often feel worried that it's just their opinion. It's one thing. It can be sort of subjective. And so all those barriers, so helping people really see. And the SRSS, there's tons of great information on the, and Susan, I see you putting some things in there. The CI3T site, is that right?
Yep.
The
Yes.
CIT3, if you do a search for that, and there's tons of resources on it in there, videos on how to do it. That's a great resource.
Well, and that's
Yep.
where all the research comes on that screener. So the researcher there, I think it's Kathleen Lane, right? Right.
Yes.
But anyway,
Yep.
she has all the research there on that screener for you all.
Yeah, and that tool is really great because a lot of times our externalizing behavior kiddos, we know them, we see them, they're there. But the ones who are internalizing, the ones who may be more prone to anxiety, things like depression, things like that, I think that it's a really great tool because, like I said, the whole purpose of MTSS is to be looking at the whole child. So we're able to identify students that way also.
All right, well, that brings us to 10:30. Thank you all so much for presenting and for all the attenders, the great questions. This will be recorded and uploaded soon. So we'll see you all in about 10 minutes for your next breakout.